Here we go. We are talking about Genesis, where it's looking more and more likely that we will or will not study Genesis for a while. We'll have to see how it goes. This is our third week of introing. Really, an intro to Genesis is an intro to the whole Bible. Some of you have heard this stuff before, of course, a lot. Why does it say do not disturb is on? That better be, yeah, that's notification. Okay, I'm gonna look at my notes. Let's look at, we ended in Exodus. We got to like Exodus 32, which was a defining chapter in the history of Israel, because that was the chapter of idolatry. Exodus is an interesting book. I said as much last week because in a sense, it's almost misnamed. You have about 7 chapters before 32. Chapter 32, the idolatry chapter, the golden calf chapter, is sandwiched between, not probably accidentally, 7 chapters on instructions on how to construct the tabernacle and what the priests are to do and how they're to be dressed and so forth. After the idolatry chapter, there's the actual building of the construction of the tabernacle. It goes through the whole thing again. And exactly the same stuff. It's like, do it this way. And then after the idolatry, they did it this way. And it goes through the whole thing again. And then Exodus ends with the cloud in the temple and God taking his place at the tabernacle. That's how the book ends. And now God has settled in among his people. But look at the ordeal to get him there, right? That's chapter 40. If you go back to chapter 1, a lot of territory covered in Exodus, from the multiplication of the Israelites and the turn against them by the Egyptians, through the plagues, the crossing of the sea, everything that happened on the mountain with the giving of the law and the idolatry, then the construction of the tabernacle. And then finally in chapter 40, we get God dwelling in the midst of his people. And then it ends. And we won't see the conquest for quite a while. The conquest won't take place until Joshua. We'll get back to that today, I think. But let's go back and see what I got to begin to move this, hopefully move this forward. Here's, let's do this. Let's take a high level pass here. Different ways of understanding the history of Israel. And a lot of attempts have been made at this, including by me. I probably have a half a dozen attempts to understand at the highest level. You know, you have the narratives of the Bible from Genesis chapter 1 to chapter 2 and Adam and Eve, chapter 3 and the fall, on and on and on. The Exodus, you know, you move through it, the conquest, Judges, you know, all these narratives. We have all these narratives woven together by different authors spanning centuries. So if you assume that the first 5 books were written at the time of Moses, which would be the 1400s, and you assume that 1st and 2nd Samuel were written after David's reign sometime, maybe during Solomon's reign, who knows, then you're talking, that would have been the 10th, 9th century, 10th century. Talking about 500 years there. Now you have the prophets. Now you're into the 700s with Isaiah. You move on and on and on. Daniel is during the exile in the 500s. Jeremiah did his prophecy on both sides of the exile. So in the 600s and 500s or something like that. Malachi, now you're into almost the 400s. So you're talking about authors spanning 1,000 years of history in their writing. And all these different narratives, one after the other. And if you start in Genesis and move all the way through 2nd Kings, in spite of that fact, it reads as remarkably like one continuous narrative. So how did that happen? And the answer is that there was a divine narrative that was woven through the whole thing from start to finish. And that narrative continues into the New Testament. And it opens up, for example, in Luke with a callback to 2 Samuel chapter 7 and the covenant promise to David that he would have an heir on the throne forever. That's the callback that Luke starts with. And then you see the birth of John the Baptist, the forerunner, and then the birth of the Messiah. And then it moves forward and then into Acts. And then finally, the story ends in Acts 28, sometime in the 60s, as the gospel moves to the Gentiles, out among the nations more. But even then, you have Revelation, which is a peek into the future. So that's the narrative. It's the narrative that spans the entirety of the human timeline. And there's a single divine narrative that weaves all of those narratives together. And it's important to understand something about that divine narrative. Otherwise, it's just a bunch of stories that you can look at disconnected. Not that the story, for example, of Bathsheba and the murder of Uriah by David and Joab isn't important in and of itself. It is. You can talk about it, but where does it fit? Where does it fit in the divine narrative that God is weaving? Because God is telling this is a story of redemption. From Genesis chapter 1 through the book of Revelation is the story of God calling and redeeming, God creating out of nothing a people for himself and then redeeming them. That's Genesis chapter 1 through Revelation 22. There are 22 chapters in Revelation. I don't remember off the top of my head. Revelation. 22, yeah, all of it. It's a divine narrative across it. And so that's what this was meant to encapsulate, at least as far as the return from exile, because of what it says about Israel. And Genesis is essentially the story of the beginnings of God calling a people to himself. That's what Genesis is about. So it starts with the three patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who was renamed to Israel. Abraham was renamed from Abram. Sarai was renamed to Sarah. And then you're going to have Isaac and Rebekah, his wife, and then Jacob, and then the four mothers of the 12 tribes, which is maybe the messiest story, the messiest genealogy in the Bible. You know, the 30s and 40s of Genesis with that family, that clan. But anyway, the point is we're in the the 21st century BC. So we're talking 4,000 years ago at this point. And they're in Canaan because, as we saw last week, I kind of revamped the thing a little bit because I'm never satisfied with this stuff, so I always change it. We have something like this, where the black is the move to Canaan in Genesis 11 and 12. We already talked about that. And then the purple, which begins in 47, when Jacob takes his clan and he moves it to Egypt under the care of Joseph, who is the administrator for Egypt. When you can see the divine narrative in place there, right? The guarding of the covenant promise is a major theme major part of the narrative of Genesis. Over and over again, these threats to the covenant come into being, and what you see is God efficiently guarding the covenant promise. Lot is a threat to the covenant. Abraham moving to Egypt with Sarah, his wife, is a threat to the covenant, because who knows if he's ever going to come back. So he gets swatted by Pharaoh back to Canaan. Intermarriage is a threat to the covenant. Abraham seeks out a wife for his son Isaac from his homeland. Is that Paddan Aram? I forget now. I don't remember. And then Isaac does the same thing for Jacob. He seeks out a wife. That's where Jacob spends 21 years trying to gain Rachel. He's a victim of karma. Who says there's no karma in the Bible? The karma of Jacob finding somebody who's a better deceiver, a better practicer of guile than he is, and he ends up working for 21 years for Laban so he can get Rachel. But anyway, he comes back. Esau's a threat to the covenant because he's the oldest son, so he needs to be taken out of the way. And then now Jacob is going to relocate to Egypt. So is that it? Because that's a threat to the covenant. They're no longer on the land. Are they just going to stay there? Are they going to get assimilated? Are they just going to become Egyptians? And the answer we find out in Exodus is no, they're not going to just become Egyptians. They're going to end up insulating themselves by necessity. They're going to maintain their own cohesive identity as a people, as a clan, and they will come out of Egypt that way. as a single people with a sense of identity about themselves, the Hebrews. And then he must mold them into a national people of God, a people of God and a nation among the nations, called out from among the nations. All that hasn't happened yet. Genesis is the beginning of that. And so you can see that then this is what the first 6 books of the Bible. Genesis, and then Exodus is coming out, and then Numbers and Deuteronomy, they're in the wilderness. Another disaster story, at least in Numbers. And then finally in Joshua, they go in and they take the land. And so, you have the timeline then. All of that takes place between the 21st century, let's just say BC, which is this century here. And then finally, working back, I'll tell you in a minute how we get these dates. It's interesting. Are we just guessing? And the answer is no, they're not just guessing. But, you have the Exodus here, maybe 600 years later, almost 700 years later. And then finally, about 1400, you have the conquest under Joshua. So you're talking about 700 years, potentially. And they somehow survive as a people. But during that time, they transitioned. They were a patriarchal clan of Jacob. We talk about the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But they were a patriarchal clan of Jacob. And you have this renaming of Jacob to Israel in Genesis. And it's not just a renaming and a reaffirmation of the covenant. Esau's not going to get the covenant. Jacob's going to get the covenant. He shall become Israel, says the angel who he wrestles with. And then Israel now hangs over the narrative. You will see it anachronistically applied to the people that come out of Egypt because they're not really a nation yet. It referred repeatedly to the sons of Israel. Not an accident. It's a divinely inspired use of an anachronism. You know what an anachronism is? It's a tough word. Yeah, when you apply elements of your own thought of your own time to prior times. That's an anachronism. You don't want to assume that the one that I gave you the example of is God loves you and offers a wonderful plan for your life, the four laws, where John 10:10, I came they might have life and have it more abundantly. And more abundantly is defined as meaning a full and meaningful life, as a fight against kind of nihilism or something. But that wasn't a problem. Nihilism wasn't a problem for the Israelites in the 1st century AD. They knew exactly who they were. That was the problem. They were the people of Israel, the people of God, and there was a disconnect between the promise, the covenant promise of the land and God ruling over them, and what was actually happening around them. That was their disconnect. Not, what is the meaning of life? I have to find myself. There's movies and TV shows made today about finding yourself. You notice that? It's because that's our struggle of the time. Nihilism, which results in narcissism, which is a whole summer. So we'll get off of that. Anyway, sons of Israel. If I'd have delved into all that, I would have blamed Vic. I would have blamed Vic for that if I'd have started talking about all that. So let's take a look here. 9 times in Exodus, they are referred to as the sons of Israel. But really, there is an Israel in the sense that they're the sons of Jacob and he's renamed Israel. But he means, this is a double entendre, a word with 2 meanings. A son of the clan, they're sons of the clan of Jacob/Israel, and also they are sons of Israel, the covenant nation, but that covenant nation doesn't exist yet. So you can see that use here really takes off in 28, right? Look at all that. This is right out of the mouth of God, by the way, in 28, 29. And then the seal with the name of the sons of Israel, which we're not going to get into because I don't remember it anyway. But you could just like the solemn occasion for the sons of Israel. So obviously it means more than just the sons of that clan. It's the sons of the covenant and the promise of a nation. I will make of you a great nation, God says to Abraham. And that nation will be Israel. And here's your one of the great double entendres in the entire Bible. The word with 2 meanings. Anticipation. We've seen this over and over again. I've talked about this so many times, it's probably boring you, but anticipation, even in that phrase, sons of Israel, there's a sense of anticipation of God fulfilling his covenant promise. And so you looks forward to, all of Exodus is then a looking forward to covenant fulfillment, which will take place in the book of Joshua. And then after that, you will see lots of reflection in the Psalms, God's great hand, mighty outstretched arm in preserving a people for himself and so forth. But anyway, that's the patriarchal clan of Israel, of Jacob, which then at some point, we talked about this last week, which at some point during their sojourn in Egypt, they become a slave people, an enslaved people, known as the Hebrews. And that's their self-concept, that's their self-identity. What did they believe religiously? Hard to say, but based on their behavior, including Moses, it seems to me they had almost no recollection. They would have maybe had a sense of Yahweh, the God of Israel, as a God, but there's no sense that anyone in Israel was devoted to the worship of the God of Abraham. So all that stuff in the great movie, The Ten Commandments, I think there's a line of, how long, O Lord, will you let your people be in distress, or whatever he says? Like they're all calling out, like the Israelites have been calling out for God to come and save them, the God of Israel to come and save them. None of that happens in the Bible. In the Bible, it's the other way around. They're disturbed. You know, it's why have you let us out into the wilderness to destroy us? Oh, that we could be back in Egypt where we got cucumbers. I never thought of cucumbers that way. You know, M&Ms maybe. You know, Klondike bars or something. But anyway, that's the period of enslavement from 1776. Let's call it. Was it exactly that? Almost certainly not. What?
1776.
Yeah, I know.
Patriotic.
Somebody has used that date to read into American history in some way. I'll bet. Anyway, that comes to an end with the Exodus under Moses, who himself undergoes a transformation in the book of Exodus and Deuteronomy. He is made into the great Savior of Israel, and he is a Savior figure, which is why one of the reasons he prefigures Jesus himself. So he's also a prophet, so Jesus becomes the prophet like Moses. Moses is the great one in the history of Israel. He led the people out of Egypt, and then he will die in the wilderness before they go in, and Joshua will take over. Joshua is primarily a military commander. He is never called a judge. He is a military commander. He will be in charge of the conquest. So we move from Exodus, what we might call wilderness wandering or something like that, judgment, and then to conquest. And in that conquest period, it will be only people over in that first generation coming out of Egypt, the idolatrous generation. Only those 20 years old and younger will participate in the conquest. So by the time the conquest happens, those people are now well into adulthood, and they're the ones in charge. And they have a completely different mindset with regard to God, because they grew up primarily in the wilderness under the one God, not in Egypt under the hundreds of gods. Let's see. So they have the conquest. Some would call it Israel's. If we call, not that I'm convinced of this, but if we call the World War II generation the greatest generation, it's kind of funny how that happens. You just kind of anoint something like that and it takes hold in the culture. So now that somebody's used the phrase the greatest generation, it's just become a given. They're the greatest generation. The same thing happened with healthcare workers during COVID. Heroes. They put all these heroes signs up. And I went, well, I don't know if I go that far. Heroes, But once you say it, once it's out there, you deny that our healthcare workers are heroes. And I say, yeah, I kind of do. Not that I don't think they do great work, they certainly do. But that's true too. Yeah, they're certainly better heroes than the basketball stars. That's true. So anyway, after the death of the conquest generation, Israel's greatest generation, and I think that's a fair assessment. If you look down the timeline of Israel, it is very hard to come up with a generation of Israel that will compete with the conquest generation as Israel's greatest generation. And in fact, let's look at that real quick. Judges 1. Joshua dies about verse 8. Yeah, look at this. No, 2. It's a chilling statement.
Kind of mentioned it twice in the first and then the 3 verses later.
Yeah, there's the double death of Joshua. After Joshua dismissed the Israelites, verse 6, they went to take possession of the land, each to their own inheritance. Job well done, not really. The people served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua and of the elders who outlived him and who had seen all the great things the Lord had done for Israel during the Exodus. Joshua, the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110. They buried him, so on and so forth. After that, whole generation had been gathered to their ancestors. Another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. Look how fast it turns. Then the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord and served the Baals, the gods of the Canaanites.
Did they forget to celebrate Passover and all those things?
They forgot everything. They reverted to form, the form being Egypt.
Because the parents didn't follow.
Yeah.
Deuteronomy chapter 6 that they were supposed to teach their kids.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
they just.
It's in the blood.
Just went along life without teaching them like we're supposed to, and the
Yeah.
next generation didn't know because they weren't taught.
It'll be in the blood all the way through to the exile. But look at the reaffirmation of their idolatry. They forsook the Lord, Yahweh, the God of Israel, the God of Abraham. They followed and worshiped various gods. The anger of the Lord burned against them, gave them into the hands of the people who plundered them, raised up judges. He's summarizing the book of Judges. Yet they would not listen to their judges, but prostituted themselves to other gods and worshiped them. They quickly turned aside from the ways of their ancestors. All of that follows. So look at the turn. The people served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua and the elders who outlived him. Verse 7. By verse 10, there's 2 verses in between. Another generation grew up. Well, of course, that's the next generation. It's not way distant future. The compression together leads you to believe that the collapse into idolatry was immediate and decisive, which sets the stage for everything that's going to happen in the book of Judges. And then it's just this spiral. It's awful. And that's Judges.
And if you really think about it, the age group of the people that went into Israel and conquered Israel would have been early 40s to late 50s.
Exactly.
And so by the time basically by the time those ones that were early 40s passed away, the next generation didn't know about Christ.
Yeah, that's how I read it. Maybe one more, maybe the kids of the kids or something like that.
So,
I don't know, but not 200 years.
no,
It's
only
40 years, 30 years, 20 years, some number like that. So that is this period right here when Israel is in danger of being absorbed into the Canaanite culture that they assimilated into the surrounding nations. So
We assume that is the nation in general, but not these individuals.
God always preserves a remnant,
There had to be
Always.
somebody who hung on to it.
always preserves a remnant. So Paul was saying it in reference to the Jews who were then being saved, but it works as a general principle. Though the people of Israel be as the sand of the sea or the stars of heaven, I forget which it is the remnant that will be saved. And he says the same thing to Elijah, who thinks he's all alone. There's only I am left. He's had enough of it. Jezebel and Ahab, I can't do it. I'm the only one left. He said, no. I have preserved for myself 7,000 who have not bowed the knee to Baal, the same exact.
So the same thing, Egypt, as they were slaves, the midwives who did not.
You have the
bow
midwives, yes, yes,
and Said they did it because they feared God.
yes. There it is. There, that's right. So it's still alive. It's just not a national, it's not a national identity by any stretch of the imagination. Yeah.
I mean, the book of Judges, if you really look at it, it's not the whole nation that is being judged. It's just little pockets, little tribes. If you read through the book of Judges, it's not the whole nation that's being judged every time. It's only
It moves.
Yeah.
It'll
it's
move
only
around.
Third tribes that are each time that is God is,
But it does, that tribe, I think that tribe does stand in the place of the nation. It's not a nation, it's not by my understanding, it's not really a nation, but it moves around and it's like a microcosm of what's going on. There was no king in Israel. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes.
That's why you call it a tribal federation.
Yes. Yeah, so you have these tribes, the 12 tribes, is really 11, because the Levites collapse. The Levites become a nomadic priestly tribe that basically has to hire, they were not, it's Israel's fault. It's the tribe's fault. They were supposed to reserve for the Levites these cities of refuge. That was their cities. They didn't do it. And so the Levites literally had no inheritance. And so they ended up, you see it with Micah and his idol. He hires the Levite to be a priest to this idol. And then that Levite, whose name is Jonathan, will end up going, the people of Dan will capture him, kidnap him from Micah, steal him on their way up to exterminate the citizens of Laish on the very northern boundary because they've lost their land to the Canaanites. So they will immigrate north outside of their allowed land, outside of Israel's allowed land, exterminate the people of that city who were doing nobody any harm, and they will steal this Levite from Micah, and that Levite will be the one responsible for setting up the idol worship in Dan. That is to this day, as it is said, whenever the book of Judges is written, survives to this day. Terrible.
Trying to think of what it would be like to be part of that woman. So those would be the people that are remaining faithful to God regardless of what's going on.
Or, yeah, oh, yeah, I mean, that almost by definition, because the point being, what's a remnant? The remnant is the group that's not submitting to the Baals, not submitting to the idolatry of the times. So why aren't they doing it? And the answer is they're devoted to this God. But we don't know anything about them. He doesn't talk about them.
So we don't know how much danger they were in for being faithful.
No, even some of the judges, they weren't particularly model citizens by our standards, right? I mean, Samson, it's really hard to find a good thing to say about him. Who's the one with, was it Gideon who didn't want to do it? Deborah? That was Deborah, right? Is that Deborah?
was the prophetess who asked another person to go on, told him he was supposed to go on. But he wouldn't do it because of the fact that unless she went with him to.
That's Gideon, right?
No.
Gideon.
No. Okay, who's the Deborah guy? Barak, yeah. So Barak, so she says, yeah, we'll go ahead and do this. And after the victory, just know you're not going to get the credit, though. A woman's going to get the credit. And it turns out she didn't mean herself. She meant Jael, the one who put the tent peg through, what's that guy's name? Sisera, yeah. This is unbelievable story, yeah. But that's what we degenerate to. It's hard to find virtue in Judges, in people, and in the book of Judges, the book of Exodus, the book of Numbers, the book of Judges. You have a few bright spots, but they're the exceptions that prove the rule. But anyway, I've been watching some stuff on YouTube on these peoples. There's lots of stuff being discovered, and they've uncovered some of these altars that the Canaanites had, and they've actually also uncovered the remains of the children and babies that they sacrificed, where their heads were cut off and so forth. These were not just idolatrous people. It's reprehensible. I mean, they were the prolific practitioners of child sacrifice, including the Philistines I'm sorry, the Phoenicians. For example, Carthage. Later on, centuries later, the Romans will have there'll be the 3 Punic Wars, Rome again. And Rome, in the third one, Rome says, I don't think we want to leave those people down there. This is the whole Hannibal thing in the Second Punic War. He's rampaging through Italy. They finally defeat him, but it scared the daylights out of him. So 60 or 70 years later, they thought, man, are we really going to leave Carthage down there to do that again? So they went down to Carthage and they utterly destroyed it. That's the famous story about salting the earth so that nothing will ever grow there again. And it turns out that the Carthaginians also were prolific at child sacrifice. And when the Romans did that, they basically put an end to child sacrifice in the Mediterranean basin. That was the Phoenicians. The Carthaginians were Phoenicians. And so all that was going on. So when God talks about in Genesis, they're going to be there 400 years because the iniquity of the Amorite is not yet complete. He doesn't just mean dancing around an altar worshiping some other god. He means putting their kids in the fire and that kind of thing, kind of stuff that Solomon is condemned for also, because he married these women who brought in this idol worship that included practices like that. Anyway, at this point then, the nation of Israel, the germinating nation of Israel, is a collection of 12 tribes. It's kind of a tribal federation. So you have these tribal elders who were in control of their tribes, and they negotiate and so on and so forth with each other, whatever. So there's no sense of nationhood at all among these people. Tribe is what you're a Benjamite, so you're loyal to the tribe of Benjamin. So whatever tribe then is going to end up on the throne later, it's going to be full of, if it's Benjamin, like it was with Saul, it's going to be all Benjamites. And that's what you see. So Shimei, when there's the guy throwing rocks at David when he's fleeing from Absalom, and it's Shimei, that's a guy from the house of Benjamin, because David the Judahite unseated Saul the Benjamite. It's that kind of thing. And so David's going to have to negotiate with all these clans, with all these tribes through the tribal elders to take control of the whole nation, which he does. So he's first declared king in Hebron, Judah. And he's there for 7 years. It takes him 7 more years to arrange to be king over all 12 tribes, or however you want to think of the number of tribes. And that's where he gets to use Abner, the military commander for Saul. Abner mediates on behalf of the 10 tribes, and he's going to deliver the 10 tribes to David, the Judahite. But a lot of sensitivity. Anyway, that's what I call, this is all me. I didn't read this someplace, but I think of it as a tribal federation, which then under David, really under Saul, maybe not even till David, becomes the nation of the kingdom of Israel. Saul does unite the nation. There is a nation there, but the Philistines are such a problem that they can't maintain their independence as a nation. The Philistines are just raiding the country whenever they feel like it. They're even setting up garrisons. So Saul, the book of 1 Samuel is going to end with Saul having to go north to attack a garrison of Philistines in the middle of Israel. They're just camped there. Well, you're not a nation if that's the case. And that's the one where David wants to go with the Philistines to attack, and then whoever it is says, no, you can't do that. They are the five rulers of the Philistines don't trust you. You got to go back to where you were, which is Ziklag. And then that's when Saul gets killed, and we go on from there. But anyway, it's not until you see Saul/David that you see a kingdom arise. That's its own identity, that's secure, has well-defined borders, can defend itself, and has even the possibility of independent prosperity. But look how short the timeline is. Solomon, right here, 966, we have the construction of the temple. And it takes 7 years, and we're now at the zenith of Israelite power and glory. And you see that in 1 Kings, where it reaches, that's where the queen of the south comes up to be the Gentile voice to the greatness of the kingdom of Israel under Solomon. That all happens then. And then almost immediately, that's like chapter 9 or 10 or something, 10 maybe, or something like that at 1 Kings. Chapter 12, Solomon loved many foreign wives. Chapter 11, Solomon loved many foreign wives. And it's solid downhill from there. And by the end of that book, or the middle of that book, there's Elijah and
You imagine having 700 wives and favors, not behind.
I can't even imagine having one wife.
You gotta please them all. 1,000 women.
You should just stop talking right now. She might have a few complaints about you too. Anyway, this is the height. Then in 931, this is the story. Solomon dies. To make a long story short, the nation partitions naturally again, tribal federation, tribes. How does it partition? Along tribal lines. So the tribes never really disappeared. The tribal loyalties were always there. So Judah and Benjamin to the south under Rehoboam, who is Solomon's son, and the 10 northern tribes, what have we to do with you, Judah? Or David, or I forget what he says, but it's Judah. Everybody to their own place. They head out and they make their own kingdom under Jeroboam. And now it's off to the races on the idolatry and disaster. So now we have Israel and Judah until final judgment on the northern kingdom of Israel in 722 BC, when the Assyrians were in control of that region. And then 612 BC, Nebuchadnezzar takes that area from the Assyrians. And then in 587, the Babylonians invade the southern kingdom, wipe it off the face of the earth, destroy the temple, and so on and so forth. There is a regathering. They return from exile, a rebuilding of the temple. We enter Second Temple Judaism, as it's often called, in the late 500s. That is the situation that will stay until the time of Jesus. Second Temple Judaism. Temple of Solomon, 966. And then Second Temple, whenever that was, 500 or whatever date that was. Nobody knows exactly. And so that's the dispersion. As the Israelites are now scattered abroad. And that scattering will then be the remnant of Israel that the messengers of the gospel in Acts will take the gospel to in those nations. So that's the Hellenistic Jews around the eastern provinces of the empire. That's all the remnants of the exiled Jews who never came back. Paul being one of them. His family stayed in exile, prospered. They obtained their Roman citizenship. They passed it down, and life goes on, and they do quite well. A lot of these Jews do quite well. We're going to meet King Agrippa in the later chapters of Acts, where he's going to have Bernice, his sister / wife, or something, sitting next to him when Paul does his testimony. That's going to land him in Rome when he appeals to Caesar. But there's an example of Jews prospering, working their way up in the Hellenistic period under the Roman Empire in the 1st century. All a result of this collapse of Judah and Israel in this period. This is where the prophets arise, somewhere right about, not coincidentally, right? Right about here in the 700s. That's when you're going to start seeing prophets arise. Isaiah on down, Jonah. Jonah prophesied to the Assyrians. Nineveh, not a coincidence. They were the ones who were the power. But now the prophets start arising. When prophets start arising, you might think that's good news. That's not good news. Prophets bring warning. They bring promise, but they bring warning. And that's what John the Baptist was doing. John the Baptist appeared on the scene not to say, "Take heart, O Israel, your Savior is at hand. Look forward in hope." No, he says, "You brood of vipers, who warned you to flee from the wrath to come? Bring forth fruits fitting of repentance. The axe is laid at the root of the tree." That's the message he brought. Yeah. So that's a synopsis, a short course on the divine narrative, the situation on the ground in which God will somehow, not magically, supernaturally preserve a people through all this mess. It will come out the other side. What will come out the other side is a new people of God consisting of both Jew and Gentile. And that's the magnificence of the story from Genesis all the way through to the end of Acts. It's an extraordinary, but that's the divine narrative. And that's what you're looking for when you read Genesis. How does this fit into the divine narrative? You be as honest as you can with yourself when you try to understand this. So you see these cycles then through this narrative of promise to anticipation to fulfillment, reflection, then more warning and promise as prophets arise or whatever. And then we start the process all over again of anticipation, waiting for fulfillment. And that's where we live right now. We live in the period between the two appearings of Christ. Anticipation, waiting for fulfillment, reflecting back on what happened. And that becomes the basis for our message of proclamation in anticipation of the return of the King. All right. Wow. That's that. Anybody have anything to say about all that? That's a summer too, that I just did in about 25 minutes. Okay. Look at that verse. Sum up Genesis then. Genesis, written probably, in my opinion, sometime during this period, right here, in preparation for the conquest. Manual of instruction and correction for the pagan Hebrews of the Exodus Israel, to prepare them for life in the polytheistic land of Canaan. I was going to summarize the purpose of Genesis, for which it was written self-consciously. It would be something like this. This is why I think Moses and whoever helped him put this together. Lays the foundation for biblical anthropology. I'll explain this. And theology. Bible students in this class might be a little more familiar with that first word and what I mean in this context. And it launches God's plan to call out and redeem a people for his name. What do I mean by anthropology? What is theology? Study of God. What is anthropology? The study of man, study of humans from a biblical perspective. So our anthropology includes something like, for example, the depravity of man. Whatever. That's anthropology from a biblical perspective. So you see that the beginnings of both theology and anthropology, the biblical understanding of both God and man, and then the relation to each other in the book of Genesis. That's the point. It distinguishes, this book does, it distinguishes the covenant God of Abraham from all the gods they worshiped in Egypt. He is uniquely himself. He is uniquely what he is in status, and we'll get back to that. It explains how Israel became the covenant people of God. Now we're in the subject matter. Genesis chapter 12 through 22 or something like that. It explains why Israel is unique among the nations that would surround them and why you don't intermingle with them. It explains why the land of Canaan was being given to Israel in the first place. You don't know. They don't know. They're slaves in Egypt. All of a sudden, they're being ripped out of the hands of the Egyptians, and they're supposed to go over there to that land. Well, they're not going to want us there. Why do we get that land? That was probably the dilemma that the 10 spies had. They never really bought into the idea that that land was given to them divinely. Joshua and Caleb understood, no, it's a done deal. The divine narrative, this land it's a done deal. It's with certainty. We're going to take that land. That's it. God has decreed it. It's our land. They just don't know it yet. And it recounts Israel's family history, how they became slaves in Egypt, and how and why they were called out of Egypt. Does all of that. It's not just it's not like the guy sat down one day and said, I'm going to tell everybody how the world was created. They didn't think like that. We're going to have to stop there. And so the first verse is the starting point. I talked about this the last couple of weeks. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, which is a direct assault, full-scale assault on the polytheism of both Egypt and the nations that would surround them in Canaan. And so we're going to talk about this list next week. And we're off to the races on Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. But I thought it was important, if you want to have the if you want the context of Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, I think it's important to understand something of the history of Israel, and particularly the context and the times in which it was put to writing. And you take a shot at answering the why question. Why was this put to writing? And what purpose did it serve for the people that it was written to? And we'll begin here, and then we'll go into this magnificent narrative. And I do believe it's a narrative of God's creative. God, the first act on the timeline of the universe is God's act himself. God's act preceded all other acts. God's act made possible all other acts. He is the prime mover, as Thomas Aquinas so eloquently, far more so than I could, stated it. He is the prime mover in the universe. So we'll start here.
It also gives us the, how God's word is inspired, because Moses is considered the writer of the first 5 books. And he didn't come into the picture till 2,500 years after the beginning of the creation. And, you know, he tells all everything, all the way from creation, all the way till the time he came into existence. So, you know, all the people that own Genesis, the first, you know, basically the book of Genesis, basically, you know, he wasn't around then, so.
Yeah, he had access to information. And you have to ask the question, especially in regard to all these names, a remarkable detail of names. This is the book of the genealogy of so-and-so, Adam, and you know, Seth or whoever, you know, one after another. This is the book of the genealogy of so-and-so begat so-and-so, and he lived this many years. And that's a remarkably detailed accounting of that stuff. Where did they get this information from? So, you know, there can be 2 answers to that. They kept records, far more so than there's written tradition, there's oral tradition, and there's God himself. Which is which, we don't know. I tend to favor oral tradition unless there's reasons to think otherwise. These people remembered well, much vastly better than we do. So we'll go ahead and stop there. Pick it up next time, Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. Thanks, Naomi. You're still out there. I don't know if you are or not.
Thank you, Gary.
Yeah. Okay, we'll see you guys later.
Adios.
Who?
Days in there, too, sound like,